Very good. Do you mind if we record your virtual outing tonight?
Oh yeah, totally fine.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's see if, there we go. It's working. All right, let's make all these little small here, like this. Very good. Cool. Well, welcome everyone to the November Grand Canyon Historical Society virtual outing. Hey, are you a member? Do you know that dues are only $35 a year? This is a screaming deal. This is an all-volunteer organization. And, you know, it's kind of like it's a model where if you like what you see, then please become a member and please donate. It's very, very simple to do. You can do it right online on the website. As a member, you'll receive 4 Old Pioneer magazines a year. And the Old Pioneer is just full of amazing Grand Canyon and regional area history that you will never find anywhere else. And eventually, as a couple, 2 or 3 years go by, these do come out onto the website and you can see them there. But by then, it's 2 or 3 years out of date, and you could be, right on time learning about this amazing stuff. So you want to do that. The CanyonHistory.org website is a huge resource. There are over 500 Grand Canyon oral histories there. There are past virtual outings, virtual tours, miscellaneous GC history. There is some amazing stuff there at GrandCanyonHistory.org. Again, membership is only $35 a year, and you can become a member at GrandCanyonHistory.org. If you have a presentation to give, please contact the Historical Society at outings@GrandCanyonHistory.org. So looking ahead, what are we talking about next month? Again, the second Tuesday of every month at 6 o'clock. That's going to be December 12th. Author Steve Trimble is going to present on his book, The Capitol Reef Reader. And that's happening December 12th at 6 in the evening. Tonight, archaeologist R.E. Burrillo presents on the Anthropology of Paleontology, a look at indigenous depictions of the fossil record in the Greater Glen Canyon Region. So R.E. is actually Ralph Burrillo, and he's an archaeologist, researcher, author, and conservation advocate. He holds a Master's of Science in Archaeology from the University of Utah, and he currently works as a project manager for Paleo West Archaeology. Ralph's area of specialization include behavioral archaeology, paleo-dietary reconstruction, history of archaeology, and ethnohistory of the Colorado Plateau. He has done field work for the U.S. Forest Service and National Park Service. His writings have appeared in Archaeology Southwest, Colorado Plateau Advocate, the Salt Lake Tribune, along with many regional publications. R.E. is the author of Behind the Bear's Ears, Exploring the Cultural and Natural Histories of a Sacred Landscape, which was chosen by Forward Book Reviews as their critics' choice for nonfiction for the year 2020. His most recent book, The Backwoods of Everywhere, Words from a Wandering Local, was recently published by Torrey House Press. Without further ado, I'm going to stop my share. R.E., I'm going to encourage you to start your share, and I'm going to go mute, and thank you so much for presenting to us tonight.
Thanks for having me. That's going to happen a lot. I have 2 cats. That last photo that you showed, how many of you were here? I don't know if you can raise your hands in the chat or whatever. How many folks were here for Morgan Sjogren's talk about Path of Light, her book following Bernheimer throughout the throughout the Greater Glen Canyon, Grand Canyon region?
Yeah, you bet.
There's a chapter, I think the first chapter in that book is called Camp Snowball. It's where she and I were basically trapped in a campground on the northern end of Comb Wash for weeks and weeks and weeks. And that's where we both decided, screw it, we're going to write books. That last photo you showed, that was me writing the Bear Sears book. Morgan took that photo. I didn't know you had it. That's pretty cool. Anyway, yeah, hi. So quick follow-up, I'm not with PaleoWest anymore, but also PaleoWest doesn't exist anymore. I'm still on friendly terms with them. They're now a Chronicle Heritage, and I now work for the Bureau of Land Management. But over and above all that, I continue to be a researcher, writer, and a research associate for Archaeology Southwest. And I'll actually be doing a third magazine with Archaeology Southwest, hopefully slated for publication next year. It's going to focus on dogs. What I am here to talk about tonight, though, let me see if I can make this share work properly. It did moments ago.
Looks good.
You can see that okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. All right. What I'm here to talk about tonight is, it's a topic I've been researching for, well, since about 2018, when it first popped up on my radar. It's a topic that I think doesn't get enough, frankly, doesn't get enough play, enough appreciation. A lot of people don't even know it really exists. And that is depictions of the fossil record and paleontology in general, in the Native American record, also in ethnography, but just sort of broadly speaking, the topic of paleontology amongst indigenous folks. And so just to tee this up, I want to make it absolutely clear. One of the most, among the most common phrases that are uttered by frustrated archaeologists, and I find myself saying it at least once a month, is "we don't dig dinosaurs." And that the image you're looking at right now actually appears on T-shirts, mugs. You can find out it's not much of a thing. It's a meme in the cultural sense of meme. When you tell people you're an archaeologist, quite often they go, "Ooh, what kind of dinosaurs?" That's paleontology. But I feel like most people understand that at this point. And where it gets tricky is it's true for the most part. But dinosaurs and other fossilized creatures do indeed occasionally play a role in archaeology and in the parent discipline of anthropology as a whole. And this, again, it's become such a common misconception that this is actually a T-shirt. That's where I got this from. Now, we start with a couple of assumptions. And by the way, just in the way of anecdote, I was invited to the Bears Ears tribal get together up in Bears Ears in 2018, 19, and then the pandemic hit because I was and remained deeply involved in the Bears Ears movement. And there I met a fellow named Kevin Madalena, who is a paleontologist from the Pueblo of Jemez. And it was from him that I basically got this impetus to start looking into this. Go, wait a minute, there's indigenous paleontology. I wasn't even sure I didn't know that was a real thing. And it's become a real passion of mine. But just to be clear, I'm not a paleontologist, nor obviously am I a Native American. But I am ostensibly anyway an anthropologist, and thus a student of human cultures, of which paleontologists and Native Americans are both prime examples. And so again, we start with this presumption that indigenous people, they articulate closely with the landscape. It's, you could almost call it a definition of what indigenous means. It's when groups have lived in a certain area for so long that they and the landscape shape each other. You know, if we take it as given that human beings as a whole evolved in Africa, it doesn't diminish or change the fact that folks have been living in the high Himalayas for so long that they can breathe up there a lot easier than I can, for example. So you live in a place where you and the environment start to look like each other. That's effectively what indigenous means. And thus they would have noticed things like fossils that were different from other rocks. They made tools out of rocks after all. And the first official evidence, at any rate, that we have of ancient people curating and appreciating more ancient rocks is actually this one that you're looking at here. I don't think there are any photographs of it, but it's a carved trilobite pendant from Yon in France that was discovered in the 1880s. And here in the United States, a good working, a long-standing working example is the awesomely named Big Bone Lick, which is a state park located in Boone County, Kentucky. And it was there and thereabouts that Georges Cuvier, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, it's known as the birthplace of American vertebrate paleontology, because it was there that Cuvier studied fossilized bones starting in the late 1700s. And this ostensibly kicked off the modern science of paleontology, at least officially. But what doesn't get discussed often enough is that he and his colleagues were led there by Iroquois folks who'd been collecting fossils there for generations. In 1813, he formally published his Essay on the Theory of the Earth, in which he not only showed that many fossils were the remains of extinct animals, but he also postulated that there had been many catastrophic events in Earth history which had caused extinctions. And, bear that in mind. Hi, Sarah, glad you could make it. So yeah, so again, keep this guy in mind because he's gonna come up again later. Moving a bit further, a little closer to home, moving farther out west, so to speak, we have the case of the humble trilobite. We saw an example just a moment ago from France. Background on the creatures themselves, they first appeared during what was used to be called the Cambrian explosion about 520 million years ago. We now know that it wasn't an explosion, it was just an explosion of visible fossils. It was still gradual evolution. But anyway, then they disappeared right around the end of the Permian period, so about 250 million years ago. So these fellows were around for around a quarter of a trillion years, which is a pretty good run. And in 1931, a fellow named Frank Beckwith, who will also come up again later, discovered that the Utes, or at least bands of the Utes, particularly in and around the Uinta Basin, had been depicting them in rock art. And not only that, but making necklaces out of them. So they also were making pendants out of these things. The Ute name translated to the little water bug in stone. And because they're armored, you can see the trilobites are their little things with armor on them. They were believed to be a protective against things like disease and, if you're very ambitious, even bullets. This is a better picture of that petroglyph panel, by the way. And speaking of the Uintas, or the Uinta Plateau, then there's the case of this handsome bastard. On the other side of the plateau, I believe, the Utes also quarried an Eocene mammal fossils in the Uinta Basin for tools, decorations, and medicine, including the bones of a lot of Eocene lacustrine species. So those would be species like these things, which are kind of sort of technically hippos, large turtles, things like that. And thus it was that in 1872, this colorful band of characters here, Othniel Marsh and Edward Cope, went out. They were both Yale paleontologists, went forth and were led by some, these Ute guides, Ute individuals, to their bone beds. They were out there looking for fossils. The Utes knew where they were, and they teamed up. And this is how, I'm going to go back real quick. This is how Uintatherium anceps, this fellow. This is how Uintatherium anceps, the North American rhino, was identified. And just as a side note, if you like reading colorful, ridiculous history about men being just grown-up children, I would very strongly recommend finding and reading a book called The Bone Wars. These two men in question would spend the rest of their careers arguing, sometimes very vehemently arguing over which one of them, quote unquote, discovered Uintatherium. Neither of them did. It was the Utes that did, but they spent the rest of their lives quarreling over this. Science can be really fun that way. Or take another example. This one's a little closer to my neck of the woods, the Four Corners. These are belemnites, or fossilized squid beaks. But they were used also for protection in battle by the Zuni, and they identified them as either teeth or weapons of primal monsters. That's how they were defined. And here's Frank Cushing again, talking about the Zuni. All kinds of beings were changed to stone. We find their forms sometimes large like beings themselves, sometimes shriveled and distorted. We see among the rocks the shapes of many beings that live no longer. And I want to dwell on this for just one moment. I don't want to dig too deep into this, but I think it's absolutely fascinating. And I'm not going to expect everybody to read this, but this in very short, is the Zuni, or at least the prevailing Zuni creation story. And in the Zuni creation story, the New Earth was flooded and racked by earthquakes. Bizarre monsters ruled in the dark, watery world. And human beings emerged, and they also were dwelling in the water. That we essentially were an amphibious species when human beings were first created, and were then welcomed onto the earth. I don't know why the rest of these aren't loading, but anyway, to keep these unfinished or proto-humans from succumbing to the great monsters, the twin children of the sun realized that the world needed to be dried out and solidified. In other words, people needed to move on to the land to get away from the sea monsters. And so they used the magical rainbow and cosmic lightning arrows, and the twin heroes set tremendous conflagration over the face of the earth, scorching it dry and hardening the ground. But now they're on dry ground, human beings, these proto-human beings. They've dropped their tails and stuff, and they're basically humans. But now there's a bunch of large predators walking around with big, powerful claws and teeth, and who multiplied and devoured people, including, well, animals and people. And so again, the twin heroes stalked across the sky, and they blasted with lightning, and once again just completely razed and demolished effectively the face of the earth through fire. And thus human beings were allowed to proliferate in peace and not have to worry about giant monsters stalking them all over the place. I don't have a photo of the Grand Canyon, but this is the Grand Canyon Historical Society, so I'm assuming you all know what it looks like. So those layers, as you go back, or as you go down those layers, the way that stratigraphy works is it gets older and older and older and older until you get to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, where you're looking at, well, I think, upwards of 4.5, even 5 billion years ago. And the Zuni, routinely make pilgrimages through the Grand Canyon. To this day, there was a fantastic video that just got an award about one of those pilgrimages. And one of my Zuni friends once put it very cheekily. He said they're the Tolkien dwarves of the indigenous community. They're crazy about minerals, and they go on these pilgrimages to collect minerals. They put, for example, micaceous minerals from certain areas they put into their pottery, and that makes it like kind of shimmer and shine. And because they've been so, fascinated with, not only fascinating with, but articulating with geology for so long, they were able to intuit and figure out that as you go down, as you go deeper and deeper and deeper into the soil structure or the rocks or whatever it is, you're probably looking at older and older stuff. That wasn't official knowledge among Westerners until Charles Lyell, at about the time that Darwin, his buddy, was publishing Origin of Species, so the mid-1800s. Zuni all along had been preaching this idea that we now call seriation, that, if you put something here and then put something on top and then put something on top and then put something on top, the one on the bottom is the oldest one. And based on that, they put together a story that sounds weirdly similar to what really happened. We now know that the dinosaurs were destroyed by fire, that it was we know that it was a comet. We know before that the area, especially in Utah, was underwater. They figured all that out all this time. So anyway, so that's the Zuni. So all of which is to say, to think that, to operate on the assumption that, the science, formally speaking, the science of paleontology is just that. It's a formal Western science. Nobody else knows about it, cares about it, realizes it exists, it's nonsense. And so those pave the way and set up the research that I've done. And I'm going to present 3 cases here, which I hope are of interest to people. They've been a lot of fun to chase down. So here, real quick, is a map was put together for Archaeology Southwest. And I'm going to cover these 3 cases before returning to the established theme of indigenous voices or ideas in paleontology. And we start with this thing, a pretty old thing, just pretty old. Real quick, Clovis peoples, when we talk about Clovis, we're talking about a group of folks, we're referring to their material culture that roamed all over North America about 11,000 years ago until, frankly, not long after that. Clovis was remarkably short-lived. And they're best known for being mammoth hunters, which they probably did a little bit, but mostly they seem to be opportunists and scavengers. But they did eat mammoths, that's for sure, as well as for making these really distinct fluted projectile points. So here's a rather fictionalized depiction of them battling a mammoth. Chances are you wouldn't do that. You would corral them, you'd be smarter about it, you'd find one that was already hurt. Those things they're indestructible. Hey, buddy. But this, they have an absolutely unique form of projectile point, spear point, technically. And this one was found, the one you're looking at right there in the photo, was found in 2017, I think, yeah, 2017, by a school teacher who was hiking around on top of Cedar Mesa. This is in the heart of Bears Ears, so southeast Utah. And this perfectly shaped, perfectly sized, absolutely intact Clovis point was sitting in context in a Pueblo 1 archaeological site, which dates to about between 700 and 800 AD. And the school teacher, being frankly a good person, did what you're supposed to do, which is ooh and ah and freak out and take some photos, and then left it exactly where it was. Contacted, at the time, BLM archaeologist Don Simonis, who I think expressed doubts, but went out there and checked on it, and sure enough, there it is. So this is now on the edge of the Cedars Museum in Blanding. But where it gets interesting is the type of chert that you're looking at there it's a very specific type of chert. It's called Alabates chert. And it's made, and it's a beautiful tiger striped chert. It's like, it's what tigers would look like if they were made out of, ice cream instead of like murder. And because it's got those distinct stripes on it, you can identify Alabates chert. And it comes from Texas and Oklahoma. I've got a photo here, right about there, where the arrow is. And so this, not me, I didn't work on this, but what the folks who investigated this were able to figure out is that the point was probably curated by some ancestral Pueblo individual or family, and had traveled about 1,000 miles and about 10,000 years from its point of origin to end up in that site on top of Cedar Mesa. It definitely didn't originate there. There was not a Clovis site there. It was somebody's precious keepsake. It was somebody, either honoring what they thought were their own ancestors, or they just thought it was a cool old thing. And I love the story because we're all human, and I freak out and get excited when I see cool old things, and so do they. So did they all along. But it's just fascinating to think this thing made it for thousands of miles and about 10,000 years. And there it was, sitting in this site on top of Cedar Mesa, so they were curating it. We also have a very old horns where the Grand Canyon comes in. This is the story. The story starts with the Wetherells, and just to be frank about it, we're talking the late 1800s. Richard Wetherell and his brothers, with the exception of John to a certain extent, were basically looters, or what we now call looters. Wetherell was trying his best. But most of their excavated materials wound up in various museums all over the country. He was excavating and shipping back to, well, he and his colleagues, other people like the Greens and McClurg and so on, were sending them back to the Smithsonian, Museum of Natural History, the Field Museum, et cetera, and that's how they were doing it. The old Indiana Jones model of get it out, sell it to a museum, and then, you know. I'm going to skip the next slide quickly because it has maybe some culturally sensitive things in it. So yeah, I'm just going to skip right over that. Just because we didn't talk about that before we started this thing. But anyway, that what you saw there real briefly was them ripping things out of the ground. That was archaeology in the 1800s. And to keep the story as quick as concise as possible, starting in 2014, this woman at center here, Lori, and her colleagues started what was called the Cedar Mesa Perishables Project, using funds from Canyonlands Natural History Association. Their job, and I hardly call it a job, it's about the coolest project I know of, is to go around to these institutions, go into their basements, dig out all the boxes, and try to figure out what these things are, where they're from, if we can find what tribe, or if she can find what tribes they're associated with, what do they have to say about them, do they want them back, so helping with repatriation. And it's been going on, it's Lori Webster, by the way, and it's been going on ever since, and it's a fantastic project that you should look into if you should, or if you can. And one of the things they found was this. It was discovered in a basket maker assemblage. So basket maker, we're talking between 1500 years ago and between 1500 BC and 400 AD, or between about 400 BC and 400 AD, specifically in the Bears Ears area. But basket maker went on for a long time. Suffice to say, they were the first like real full-time farmers in the Four Corners area. And it was discovered by Wetherell in the 1890s, and he put a thing on it and said it was with archaeology and threw it in a box, and there it, you know, sat forever and ever and ever. And it was identified when they found it by a fellow there in Flagstaff named Chuck LaRue, who's a wizard with animal bits, as that of a Harrington's mountain goat. And the fascinating thing about that is Harrington's mountain goat occupied much of the Southwest right up until about 13,000 years ago. Or roughly the time that human beings first appeared in this part of North America. We know that humans were here for a lot longer than that, obviously. But they really start, you know, moving into at least the Four Corners, the Grand Canyon area, right around then, maybe a little before, maybe a little after, but most people think a little after then. So this particular species of mountain goat went extinct approximately about the time people started moving into the area. And fossil specimens have been found in dry caves throughout the entire Intermountain West, although the goats evinced a particular love for the Grand Canyon for reasons we don't understand. And just like modern mountain goats, their fleet-footedness likely evolved as a strategy for avoiding predators, allowing them to scramble up and down steep rocky slopes that bears and wolves couldn't effectively navigate. And in the Grand Canyon in particular, where these things actually lived, hunter-gatherers lived there during the late Archaic period, so between about 4,000 and 2,000 years ago. These late Archaic folks used to seek out these same extremely difficult to access caves where Harrington's mountain goats sought refuge, and they would leave these split twig figurines in the caves amongst the fossilized bones. Why? So again, they went extinct about 13,000 years ago, and about between 4,000 and 2,000 years ago, people really made a point of scrambling into these extremely difficult to reach caves within the Grand Canyon, finding these bones of this now fossilized species and leaving split twig figurines behind. Experts like Robin Hendrick and Steve Emsley, formerly of National NPS, think it was a form of, quote, symbolic magic. That in other words, that they knew these creatures weren't around anymore, that they likely presumed that the fossils were from a long gone ancestor of modern goats. And, you know, this was basically a ritual aimed at either honoring these ancestral mountain goats or asking for their blessings. Which may seem like a leap until you realize that ancient Native Americans were, again, just as interested in ancient history as everybody else seems to be. And if we jump over to Bears Ears, the story gets even weirder. We've never found, to this day, at least on the record, we've never found a split twig figurine in situ in Bears Ears, but we found this. And this is located in a canyon that connects Cedar Mesa, connects the heart of Bears Ears to Glen Canyon and Grand Canyon. So whether or not these folks brought their split twig figurines with them into when the late Archaic saw the emptying out of people from the Grand Canyon as they became more and more interested in art agriculture, moved over to places like Bears Ears where it's a lot easier to practice agriculture. They may not have taken the split twig figurines with them, but they took the imagery. And they also took the horn. And thus it ended up in the bottom of Grand Gulch. Again, thousands of years and hundreds of miles from its point, or at least dozens of miles. No, a couple hundred miles from its point of origin. And then there's these fellas, extremely old footprints. Exhibit C is located near the modern town of Kanab and it's in the Greater Grand Staircase Escalante area. Here you find an assemblage of enormous dinosaur tracks, and by enormous I mean right about this, but you know, bigger than the ones we usually find, which are like smaller than my hand. That ascribed to, our paleontologists ascribed to Dilophosaurus, which is a genus of medium-sized theropods. I don't know what most of those words mean, but I've been told they mean things. The main set of tracks leads straight to the edge, as you can see, straight to the edge of a very steep cliff, and at the edge of a mountain or a mesa top. It almost looks like they went right to the edge. And a friend of mine, writer and historian Scott Thibany, appreciated that ancient inhabitants of the area would have studied the footprints with intense interest to the point of estimating the animal size and weight with considerable accuracy. He did a summary on this for NPR, and I'm not going to do it much justice here, but he recounted to a blog post in KNAU Public Radio that he once went there to this site with a Navajo tracker, a Dene hunter, in other words. At that particular dinosaur track site, who was able to guess the size and shape of the animal, that as well as the fact that it was running and approximately what its stride was based on the footprints that you see there in the photo, and just based on this individual's knowledge of, you know, watching, you know, prints going into mud and stuff. It's like what he did for a living. And when those ideas were turned over to the paleontologists, who had applied a whole bunch of math and models and science, they said, yeah, they're about right. Which is really impressive on its own, but it gets even more impressive when you, not literally, but figuratively leap over the edge there and look back toward where those prints are located, and you find this. And this intense and meaningful attention to the ancient tracks is demonstrated on the rock face just beneath them, where an extensive pictograph panel includes really unmistakable impressions and more stylized interpretations of the tracks themselves. Their specific meanings are unclear because they're clouded by time, but what is clear is ancient inhabitants of the mesa recognized and interpreted this even more ancient trackway as a significant component of their landscape and its history. And I've got an even closer photo I can show you. It's hard to imagine what they were thinking about. The one right at center there is just a depiction of one of the tracks. But if you look to the left and the right, there are what look like at least humanoid or anthropoid figures that are also kind of like dinosaur tracks. So it's difficult to tell exactly how they were interpreting it, but that they were interpreting it, that they were trying to analyze it, get stories, get explanations about the landscape from it is unmistakable. And again, indigenous people articulate closely with the landscape. If there's giant monster tracks out there, they're probably going to see them. And these are just some examples. Pretty much, as I was saying before we got started, pretty much every time I give this presentation, and I think I'm up to about 20 now, different versions of this presentation, I get bombarded afterward with texts, emails. If I give it live, sometimes people will come up to me and just talk to me saying, hey, so I know a place where there's this and that and stuff, and fossils and rock art together. And it's so the project grows whether I like it or not, because people are really interested in this stuff, and I'd like people to be interested in it. There on the left, for example, is a necklace made out of what are called crinoid fossils. You can find a ton of crinoid fossils in and around the Grand Canyon. Bottom right is courtesy of the National Park Service. That's a bird effigy carved out of a fossilized shell. And top right, also courtesy of the National Park Service, that's from petrified forest. That is a piece of petrified wood carved into a projectile point. Petrified wood, by the way, to the Diné traditionally was called frozen or fossilized rainbow, rather cheekily, because they could see that they were shaped like wood. But those are examples, and I could go on and on and on. And as the project continues, I probably will. But let's move ahead to, I call it concluding thoughts, but it's really the backstory and how I bring this all together. So, to return to the issue of indigenous peoples here in the US and elsewhere, and the broad topic of paleontology, really the first time you start finding controversy is with this thing, the Maastricht monster. The first fossils of this creature were found by local folks in a chalk quarry near the Dutch city of Maastricht in 1764. And one particular skull was enormous and was interpreted at the time as a monster, possibly even a dragon. There's a lot to be said about dragons in the mythology of both Europe and Asia, and the fact that you could find things like this in the ground. And it was stolen by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1794. It was interpreted at the time as a fossilized skull of, again, a monster or a dragon, but it was later identified as a mosasaur, which is a late Cretaceous aquatic carnivore. And it's now a prized centerpiece in the Museum of Natural History in Paris. And by the way, for those of you who had the bad luck of watching Jurassic World, my heart goes out to you. There's a mosasaur in Jurassic World. It's this. They were actually about this size. So pretty big, but not that big. That's Hollywood for you. Velociraptors, by the way, were about the size of chickens. I'm just here to spoil everyone's fun. But anyway, so recall I said a moment ago, it's a prized piece of the museum in Paris. It's not from Paris. It's not from France at all. It was stolen by Napoleon as part of his, conquest of Europe. And there was a fantastic article written by these researchers whose names you can see at the top, Ferenestra and Jansen, I believe that's how you pronounce it, Feenstra and Jansen, over the fact that, repatriation of this giant fossil from the French back to the people who had actually found it, or their descendants rather, has become kind of tricky. They keep asking for it. And the answer is always the same. It's that science is the officialized and legitimizing process of perspective. Everything else comes second to that. And in the case of indigenous traditional cultural knowledge, it is often a distant second. So the official answer is, we did science to this thing. It was actually Georges Cuvier. Remember I said he'd come up again? We did science to this thing, therefore it's ours. All you did was apply, fuzzy thinking and mythology. We're the scientists, it belongs to us. And that's the stance they've taken all along. Elsewhere in the Bears Ears area, speaking of indigenous representation in paleontology, this is a door lintel on a later Pueblo cliff structure that was found to contain the fossilized track of a dinosaur species called Growliter. I'm not going to say where it is, but it's actually pretty easy to find. Nearly every other stone used in the creation of this particular structure, this particular cliff structure, was local sandstone blocks and slabs that were harvested right there in the canyon from no more than 20, maybe 30 feet away. But this thing, the track, actually, if you can see in the photo on the left, it's the door lintel. It's the one on the top. It's a slightly different color. It's actually a different type of rock. It came from closer down by the San Juan River. And so people carried it all the way from the San Juan River. We're talking now from there to there, probably 20 miles approximately, and positioned it with the track facing downward. So as you walk into this structure, you're walking under this fossilized track. And it was the aforementioned geologist and paleontologist, Kevin Magdalena, who's a member of the Pueblo Jamez, who assisted with the interpretation of the find and provided the cultural side of it. Here's why they would have chosen that. Here's why it was important to them. And when the researchers that were working with Magdalena put together the paper and submitted it to, I believe, the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology, reviewers stripped Magdalena's name from it and stripped his contribution from it because, again, it wasn't scientific. What he was providing was cultural knowledge. That's not science. Get it out of there. And luckily, as a form of, I don't know, vengeance isn't the right word, but Schadenfreude, it didn't get published. They ended up pulling it, partly because of that, in protest. But it would have been published without the name of the guy who explained the culture and why it's there, like why it was built in the first place and why this thing was carried all the way from the river to be, put into place as the door lintel and the structure, which is the real story of it. Outside of that, it says that there were dinosaurs in the area. Okay, we know that already. The real story is what it was doing there. And that really gets to the heart of this debate about, does it count? If it's not scientifically verifiable knowledge, does it count? In a paper in the Journal of Paleontology in 1935, paleontologist named Edward Kindle suggested that Native Americans should be credited with at least a handful of scientifically significant fossil discoveries. And for reasons like, the ones I've just been talking about for half an hour. And his suggestion was strenuously rejected by American Museum of Natural History paleontologist George Gaylord Simpson, who was the head of the Journal of Paleontology at the time, because they were, quote, casual finds without scientific sequel. So as I said earlier, science is the official and legitimized practice. Everything else comes second to that, and indigenous cultural knowledge doesn't count at all. And so now again, the relationship between Native Americans and anthropology and its offspring archaeology also has a complicated history. And for example, in his 1960 book, Custer Died for Your Sins, one of the greatest book titles I've ever found, Lakota scholar and author Vine Deloria Jr. piquantly summed it up like this. He said, "Into each life it is said some rain must fall. Some people have bad horoscopes. Others take tips on the stock market. McNamara created TFX and Edsel. Churches possess the real world. But Indians have been cursed above all other people in history. Indians have anthropologists. The origin of the anthropologist is a mystery hidden in the historical mists. Indians are certain that all societies of the Near East had anthropologists at one time because all those societies are now defunct." And that was the situation in the late 1960s and through the 1970s. And it's changed. As the field of American archaeology has progressed through time, it's become and continues to be more and more and more inclusive. So that by the time of at least the Animus La Plata project, the early 2000s, this is when my mentor, Bill Light, really puts the hammer down on like, this is when they started actually hiring indigenous people to be archaeologists instead of just consulting with them and then stealing their stuff and putting it in a museum. They started representing upwards of a third of archaeological field crews. Now that was specific to the Animus La Plata, but as a trend, it has sort of continued. The company that I only recently parted ways with, 3 of my employees and 1 of my bosses were Native American individuals. Also a lot of gay folks, a lot of queer folks. It's becoming an extremely diverse field. This is a field photo taken by, not by me, but by a colleague of mine. Another one taken by a friend of a friend at the Shumla Research and Education Center of a, here's an indigenous fellow using what's called an XRF or X-ray fluorescence to attempt to date some really ancient rock art. And it's the marriage, the melding of these, Western science with traditional cultural knowledge. And so archaeology's gotten there. Like we're starting to get there. And it's why I'm comfortable being an archaeologist now. If we were still the way we were in the 60s and 70s, I would probably still be a bartender in Flagstaff. But it's becoming a lot more inclusive and a lot more respectful. And people in archaeology are starting to realize that traditional cultural knowledge is knowledge. It's not just myth, it's not just stories, it's knowledge by people who know the land probably better than we do. And if it's working well for us in archaeology, why stop there? And that's my hanging question for this talk. Why stop there? Why not paleontology? Why not botany? Why not respect all traditional cultural knowledge? And at that point, at this point in my story, I just want to give a few shout outs to some folks that have helped. Again, this is ongoing, it's been ongoing forever and ever and ever. But also, before I hand it over to the MC to chair some questions, if anybody happens to have any, I want to share a couple of anecdotes. Because you'll recall I said every time I give this talk, something happens. Last time I gave a version of this talk was for Grand Staircase Escalante Partners in Escalante, Utah. And I spent about 35 minutes this time. I think that time was right around 20, 25 minutes, hammering on the fact that I'm an archaeologist. We don't do dinosaurs. I'm just trying to show respect for the anthropology around paleontology in North America. Everyone had a great time. We drank a bunch of beers and we went to sleep. And the next morning, my friend Aaron Howarth, who's now with the Bureau of Land Management in Moab, who used to also live and work there at Grand Canyon, was on patrol. So I couldn't hang out with her yet. And I wanted to hang out with her. She's one of my best friends. So I went for a walk along the Escalante River, waiting for her to get off work. And I wandered off trail for some reason. I was trying to avoid some loud kids and their dogs or something. And I noticed a big slab of rock that had slid down, I don't know, thousands of years ago. And it looked, I swear, it looked like it had dinosaur tracks on it. And Aaron got off work and I said, Aaron, you're not going to believe this. I think I might have found some dinosaur tracks. I hadn't heard of any in that area. And they're right off the trail. Clearly, they've been seen by somebody before. And so she left her uniform on and I dragged her back out there. So here's my dear friend Aaron Howarth, 4 scale, just cheesing it at the bottom of the slab. And those are indeed dinosaur tracks. And they had indeed never been recorded before. She showed them to the Grand Staircase Escalante paleontologist, went out there, recorded them. That individual also found a few other trackways on that same slab that I wouldn't have seen because, again, not a paleontologist. But that's how that's going to happen. That's how it's going to happen. After a night of beer and wine and lecturing people about how archaeologists don't do dinosaurs, that's the morning that I'm going to find a dinosaur trackway that's never been recorded in Escalante before. The other one I would slap together really fast. So we've got a couple of people here who were part of a volunteer operation out in, sorry, let me go back. Who were part of a volunteer volunteer trip out in the Dark Canyon Wilderness, and again, Bears Ears, when I was working there for the Forest Service. Aaron and Mike, I think. Anyway, we were chatting beforehand. They reminded me that they were on the 2014 trip with wilderness volunteers helping us go out and record and monitor archaeological sites in Dark Canyon, which then reminded me that it was in 2014 on that wilderness volunteers trip out there in Dark Canyon, in a side canyon called Poison Canyon, that my boss and I stumbled upon this. We don't know what that is. And I've yet to find a paleontologist who can say with any certainty, oh, it's this. It's a trackway from a weird worm, or it's the spine of something weird, or we have no idea. It's about, unfortunately, I didn't have a scale with me because we just found it totally by accident, but what you're looking at there is about 2 feet across in diameter, 2 feet in both directions. And we found that on that same 2014 Wilderness Volunteers trip, and we're archaeologists, and we have no idea what it is. We just took a GPS point and said, we're gonna figure this out, and we never have. So yeah, in conclusion, archaeologists don't do dinosaurs, except sometimes we do. Again, the broader conclusion here is just has to do with like paleontologists, botanists, everyone else, and all the other scientists. Please take a cue from us. Archaeology is still, it's still coming along. It's still male dominated. It's still white dominated, you know, and it's increasing diversity over time, but we're getting better and better every day at listening to indigenous people and realizing that they have knowledge to share with us. And my advice is to all the other sciences, jump on board. It would benefit you tremendously. And now I'm going to stop sharing and switch to the main camera because my throat's starting to hurt a little bit.
That was lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ari. I've got a question for you. When I think of Grand Canyon and the Colorado River, I go up and down the river thinking about anyone, a human, wandering around this landscape, maybe 10, 20,000 years ago, or maybe 10 or 20 days ago. They can't help missing the dinosaur bones up at where Split Mountain gorges out into the Uinta Basin. They would pick up on, as you said, the split twig figurines. They would pick up on the petrified wood laying on the ground in its 3 and 4 foot diameter log chunks, either at Lee's Ferry or at the Petrified Wood National Park. They would pick up on the sloth dung balls, the softball-sized dung balls in Rampart Cave. They would see the Harrington skull in Stevens Cave in Grand Canyon. Anybody with an eye for anything, and indigenous peoples clearly have an eye for everything, would be seeing this stuff. So it just makes perfect sense what you're saying.
Yeah, it's once you start down that path, it almost becomes like a self-evident, like a foregone conclusion. It was Karen, by the way, not Aaron. Aaron was my friend who works for the BLM. It was Karen and her husband that were out there doing the volunteer stuff. But anyway, it rained on us a lot. Yeah, it's one of those things that it just at that Bears Ears gathering in particular, talking to Kevin Magdalena. I don't know why it hadn't occurred to me before, but of course, these folks are going to see these things, and they're not, you know, they're not as people of the 14 through 1800s used to preach, and certain racist assholes still preach that they're not simple-minded, they're not backwards, they're human beings. They just lived a different lifestyle.
Right.
And they would apply just as much critical thinking. They would be just as curious about these things. And because of that, and because they've been looking at them and thinking about them for a long time, they've built up quite a store of knowledge. And it's a real shame to just regard it all as mythology and just, you know, find, you know, once again, a way of sort of being dismissive and not listening to indigenous people and going, no, we're scientists. We know what's right. most of our insights are either come from, or many of our insights, I should say, either come from intuition or just plain creativity. And then the scientific method is we apply, we test and test and test. These things don't come out of thin air. Their forms of knowledge are no more, you know what I mean? It's amazing to me how much this really isn't appreciated or known outside of, a few researchers like myself and a woman by the name named Adrienne Mayer, who wrote some great stuff about this topic. And that's about it.
I want to drill into this for a minute, especially with the split twig figurines where Emsley and Mead and Agenbrod had this bedtime story concept of, okay, I'm going to make a split twig figurine, and I'm going to put a spear through it, because I see the bones here of a Harrington mountain goat. Boy, I'd sure love to eat one of those things because I'm hungry. So I'm gonna make this little split twig figurine. I'll put a little spear point through it, and maybe my hunting is going to be good, and maybe I'll capture one of these creatures. Is there any indigenous concurrence with this, with a bunch of white guys thinking about this, saying, well, this is what they were doing?
Boy, not to my knowledge. It's unfortunately a lot of this, and I'm probably preaching to the choir if there are a bunch of researchers on the Zoom tonight, but unfortunately a lot of these types of research and publications and so on become extremely, I think, siloed is the modern, not too cynical way to say it. Elitist is how I would put it, because I'm a little more critical of my fellow academics. But no, especially in the case of I don't want to point out any individual here, but when I've spoken to folks there in the Flagstaff area, I think this came up in a chat with Scott Thibany, although don't quote me on that. I think we were mostly talking about dinosaur tracks. There's been some little give and take and back and forth with indigenous folks there at the Grand Canyon who are working there or guiding there and asking, hey, what do you think of this? And they'll say something like, man, I don't know, maybe. But as far as like a formal sort of ethnographic investigation, not that I know of, at least not that's been published. And that again speaks to that problem about like so many archaeological, I'd say the overwhelming bulk of archaeological careers and I know Agenbrod in particular wasn't an archaeologist specifically, he was kind of a mammoth specialist, but so many of those careers have been built on anthropologist or archaeologist investigates thing, comes to conclusion based on theories and math and other cleverness, publishes it, goes and conducts another study, and then it becomes this kind of cycle where we fill our libraries and we fill our gray literature. The public never sees any of it. The indigenous community they don't have access to those kind of journals and stuff because universities are expensive, and it just becomes very again, siloed is a polite way to put it, but very white palace and very elitist and locked off. And I can't stand that. That's why I work with groups like Archaeology Southwest. A version of this story appears in here, but it's a very short version because they're all about public scholarship. And they're more and more they're about involving the tribes and having tribal, not just in the role of consultant, but actual collaborators and authors and researchers come along and have an equal place at that table. So much of that research, including most of what I've just talked about, with the exception of the Dorlintel and Bears Ears, really didn't involve any tribal input or collaboration, at least to my knowledge. And that's the thing that needs to change.
Got it. Thank you. What I'd like to do now is encourage anyone who has any questions for Ari to simply unmute yourself and introduce yourself and ask your question.
It's going to be a quiet group again tonight.
Maybe.
Ralph, this is Mike. That last fossil track you showed sure looked like a backbone to me.
It does to me. I'll share it again. Any of you know paleontologists, feel free to do a screen grab and get back to me. That's what I thought too. It looks like a spinal column, but the way that it's formed, you see how it kind of bubbles out of the surface of the stone. It's been suggested it's more likely some sort of trackway of something moving under the sand, millions of years ago, left it as a trackway. But again, I don't know. It looks like a spine to me. It looks like a spine or a tail.
Yeah, very much so.
But it's out there in Poison Canyon somewhere. Yeah, we found it when we were out recording sites. Still have no idea what it is.
Don't be shy. Okay, I'm calling again. Questions for RE. Simply unmute yourself and ask away.
So, Ralph, this is Mike again. We sure had a lot of fun on that volunteer trip. Are you planning on doing anything like that again?
Boy, I haven't worked there in a while. Everyone that I worked with at Bears Ears has by this point retired. So I'm down here in Arizona now. The monument didn't exist at the time, so it was a lot easier for the Forest Service especially in areas like that, to put together their own programs and projects and just kind of go out and do them. They're still in the process of putting together a management plan up there. There are still lawsuits pending, one by the state of Utah against the Biden administration for restoring the monument. That was thrown out, and I know this because I'm on that lawsuit. That was thrown out by the 9th District Court of Appeal, 9th District Circuit Court. That's it. I don't know. Words. But it's being appealed by the state of Utah. It might go as far as the Supreme Court. Which, things like that make it hard for agencies to come up with things like management plans. If they know that within a year or 2 years, it might get thrown out and they'll have to make yet another one. So permitting things in Bears Ears right now is a bit tricky. Having said that, I still lead tours up there for Taos Archaeological Society was the last one. Great Old Broads for Wilderness has had me lead some tours up there. Bears Ears Partnership and Canyonlands Field Institute's the one most often that grabs me and whoever wants to join and go and do interpretive tours. But as far as work, like formal work, no, I'm not with the Forest Service up there anymore. I'm down here in Arizona.
Very cool. Any more questions for RE tonight?
How long did we make it? About an hour?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Yeah, and there's, like I said, there's so much more to say about this. If it ever turns into a full informal paper, one thing that I've been looking at a lot recently is the Popol Vuh, or the creation story of the Yucatec Maya, which includes first trying to make animals, to respect the creator's heart of sky and so on. Failing at that, throwing them into the ocean, and then accidentally creating a bunch of monsters, and then they make things that are almost human but not quite. They can just chatter and they don't have any language, and those became monkeys. And then they finally get it right with human beings. And again, weirdly similar to not only the fossil record, but like the theory of natural selection, that here's all the basic animals and a bunch of monsters, and they all went extinct. And then these things that are almost human but not quite, and then human, and those are the primates. And again, we in the West started to really formally recognize that in the 1800s. So a lot of stuff to dig into, no pun intended. So it's, yeah, it's ongoing, and I'm sure I'll give this talk in the future, and it'll be even longer. So if you have any questions, you can save them for that.
We certainly look forward to that.
Hey, Ari,
No.
do we have a book and not paper? I think this would make a book.
I hear dogs barking. Oh, maybe. It'll take me more research and data collection to get like a book length knowledge, but I mean, my publishers, they're all about this kind of thing. You know, breaking the boundaries of knowledge, and especially inviting in, you know, marginalized voices that really, whose knowledge has been ignored or dismissed in the past. They're crazy about that. Tory House Press. So yeah, probably at some point in the future.
I'm voting.
I'll tell them. I'm actually going to be in Salt Lake City at the end of the month to meet with my publisher to help with a fundraiser, and also to talk about a couple of forthcoming book contracts. So I'll mention it to them.
Cool. It's lovely. Well, with that, I think it's time to wrap up tonight's event. And again, thanks to Ari Burrillo. I really appreciate your giving us this talk tonight. This virtual outing will be recorded and available on the Historical Society website. Just so you remember, Tuesday, December 12th, that's the second Tuesday of the month, that's 6 o'clock. Virtual outing will be ganging up again. Steve Trimble will be presenting on the Capitol Reef Reader. And with that, I think it's time to say goodnight to everyone. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks for coming, everyone.